The mess hall went quiet the moment she walked in. Not because she was loud, not because she demanded attention, because something in the way she moved made instincts fire before logic could catch up. Sergeant Cole Ramirez saw her first. Navy uniform, no combat patches, carrying a tray like she was just passing through. He leaned to his buddy and said what everyone was thinking. Another desk officer, 2 weeks and she's gone. He was wrong about everything except the uniform. What he couldn't see, what none of them could see, was the classified file locked 3 levels deep in Naval Special Warfare Command. The one that described, in careful bureaucratic language, exactly what Lieutenant Mara Voss had done in places that didn't appear on public maps. They laughed at her that first night. 48 hours later, they would be standing at attention. If this story already has you leaning forward, subscribe to the channel right now, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere. This is just the beginning. The drive from San Antonio took 4 hours, and for most of that time, Lieutenant Mara Voss sat in the back of the government-issue sedan watching the landscape turn from highway sprawl into flat, baked nothing. West Texas had a way of announcing itself. The sky went wider, the shadows went longer. The towns got sparse and then disappeared entirely, replaced by mesquite scrub and caliche dust, and the occasional windmill turning slow against a horizon that seemed to go on past the edge of the world. By the time Fort Redstone's main gate appeared, the guard shack, the concrete barriers, the flag snapping hard in the dry wind, Mara had been awake for 19 hours. She hadn't slept on the plane from Virginia. She hadn't slept during the layover. She'd sat in airport chairs reading through the briefing packets a second time, then a third, looking for the thing that always hid between the lines of official documents, the thing they never said directly. The sedan stopped at the gate. A young MP leaned down to the window, saw the Navy ID, and his expression flattened in a way that was almost professional. Name and purpose of visit? Lieutenant Mara Voss, Joint Operations Coordination, assigned to Colonel Decker's staff. The MP checked his clipboard, found the name, checked it again, like he was making sure. Drive through to Building 7, ma'am. Visitor parking is marked. Building 7 turned out to be an administrative block set back from the main training corridors. Beige concrete, fluorescent lighting visible through tinted windows, an American flag, and a unit banner out front. A staff sergeant named Okafor was waiting outside with a clipboard of his own and the practiced expression of someone who processed visitors for a living and had learned to have no opinions about it. Lieutenant Voss. He pronounced it correctly, which she noted. I'll get you checked in and squared away. Colonel Decker will see you at 1400. What time is it now? 11:40. Good. Can I drop my bag and get a look at the grounds? Okafor paused, just slightly. The grounds are an active installation, ma'am. I can arrange an escort. I'll stay on the marked pathways. I just need to stretch my legs. He processed that for a moment, then nodded. Rooms in Building 4. I'll walk you. She followed him across the parade ground, and that was where she first got a real look at the place. Fort Redstone wasn't enormous by military standards, but it had a particular kind of energy, a forward deployed feel even on a garrison installation. The training corridors were visible beyond a chain-link fence to the east, obstacle structures rising against the pale sky. A Humvee column was returning from somewhere, dust still settling off the fenders. 2 soldiers ran past in PT gear, moving faster than comfort suggested, and neither of them looked at her. To her left, a group of Marines near a motor pool was doing something complicated with radio equipment. A sergeant crouched over a PRC-117 with a technical manual open in the dirt beside him. She caught the frequency being called out, recognized the band immediately. Didn't say anything. The barracks room was small and smelled like pine cleaner and old paint. There was a metal frame cot, a wall locker, a small desk bolted to the wall, and a window that looked at the exterior wall of the next building approximately 8 feet away. Mara set her bag on the cot, unzipped it, and didn't unpack. She sat for exactly 4 minutes, then went back outside. The mess hall at Fort Redstone operated on a schedule board posted by the door, and by the time Mara arrived for the dinner rotation at 17:30, the place was already running at capacity. It was a large space with long tables and the specific noise profile of several hundred people eating at once. Metal trays, boots on linoleum, multiple conversations at competing volumes, the kitchen exhaust fans running loud above everything else. She picked up a tray, worked through the line, and looked for an empty table. There weren't any. She chose one that had space on the end, 4 soldiers halfway through their meal, a gap at the near corner, and sat down. Nobody acknowledged her. She wasn't there for conversation. She was 10 minutes in when they arrived. She heard the group before she saw them, because the noise level in the section around her dropped just enough to register. That particular kind of quiet that happens when a dominant personality enters a space and everyone recalibrates involuntarily. She looked up. Sergeant First Class Cole Ramirez was broad across the shoulders and moved with the comfortable authority of someone who had never walked into a room and wondered whether he belonged. He had a squad with him, 6 soldiers, all of them in the unspoken formation of men who defaulted to their leader's energy. They were carrying trays. They were also looking directly at her. Ramirez stopped in front of the table. He didn't ask to sit. He just stood there for a moment, reading the uniform, reading the rank, and arriving at a conclusion that was visible on his face before he said a word. "Lieutenant," he said. Not a greeting, an identification. "Sergeant," Mara said. She kept eating. "You're the Joint Ops Coordinator they sent from Navy?" "That's what my orders say." One of the soldiers behind Ramirez, younger, probably 22, with the energy of someone auditioning, made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was close. Ramirez pulled out the bench across from her and sat, which meant his squad sat too, spreading out along the table with the practiced efficiency of people who did everything together. "Long drive from San Antonio," he said. 4 hours. "You fly into Lackland?" "Randolph." He nodded slowly. There was something assessing happening behind his eyes. "So what does Joint Ops Coordination actually mean? Because the briefing I saw said liaison, but nobody briefed us on what you're actually here to do." Mara looked at him directly for the first time. He was probably 34, 35. Combat patches on the uniform that took time to earn. A scar along the jawline that hadn't come from a kitchen accident. "I'm here to understand how your unit operates," she said. "Observe, document, and report back." "Observe." He said the word like he was testing the weight of it. "You been in a field environment before?" "A few times." The young soldier at the end of the table, Mara read the name tape, Solus, leaned forward. "Like, what kind of field environment? A tent behind the phobie?" Nobody laughed loudly. A few people smiled. Mara picked up her fork. The kind where the tent wasn't always an option. Solus glanced at Ramirez. Ramirez was still watching her. "We've got a full training cycle running," Ramirez said. "PT at 0530. Obstacle course starts at 0615. That's not a press and smile event, Lieutenant. That's a real evaluation." "I saw the schedule. You planning to observe from the sidelines?" She looked at him steadily. "Where would you suggest I observe from?" There was a beat of silence. Then Ramirez said, "You want to run it?" "If you're inviting me." He leaned back slightly. Something shifted in his expression. Not respect, not yet, but recalibration. The conclusion he'd arrived at when he walked in was being quietly revised. 0615, he said. "Training field, east of the motor pool. Don't be late." "I won't be." He stood, picked up his tray. His squad followed in the smooth, automatic way they did everything. Solus was the last one up. He looked at her for a moment, then at his sergeant's back, then at her again. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "Sergeant Ramirez ran that course in 2240 last month. That's a post record." Mara looked at him. "Good to know." He left. The ambient noise of the mess hall settled back in around her. She finished her food, returned her tray, and walked back to Building 4 under a sky that was going orange and red and violent at the edges, the Texas sun going down the way it did out here, big and slow and completely indifferent. In her room, she set her watch for 0430. She was going to need the extra time. The pre-dawn run was something she did every morning, regardless of time zone or circumstances, and Fort Redstone's perimeter road was good for it. 3.2 miles of loose asphalt with enough grade change in the southwest corner to keep it honest. She was back and showered and standing at the equipment locker by 0555, pulling out boots that had covered more ground than the men she'd be running against would probably believe. The training field east of the motor pool was laid out across approximately 2 acres of packed dirt and engineered terrain. The obstacle course was a serious piece of infrastructure: high walls, rope climbs, a water obstacle that looked cold even in the growing warmth of the morning, a low crawl section under wire, a cargo net climb, weighted carries marked with distance flags at the end. The full configuration ran roughly a mile and a half when you accounted for the transition runs between stations. Ramirez's squad was already there when she arrived, which meant she wasn't late, but they'd been watching the access road to see when she'd appear. She registered that without showing she had. There were 8 of them counting Ramirez, plus 2 other soldiers she didn't recognize who appeared to be there to observe in time. One of them had a clipboard. The other had a handheld stopwatch and a tablet mounted in a waterproof case. An official eval then, or close enough to one. Ramirez looked at her across the distance of the starting line. His expression was professionally neutral, which told her he'd made a decision in the last 15 hours to take this seriously. "Morning, Lieutenant." "Sergeant." "Standard rules. You breach each obstacle, you proceed to the next. You skip or fail an obstacle, you restart. Time starts when I say go." "Understood." Solis was stretching nearby, and he looked up at that, catching something in the flatness of her reply that made him straighten a little. Ramirez raised his hand. "Ready." Mara settled into the starting position. The ground was firm under her boots. The air still held the night's chill, but that would be gone in minutes. She breathed out once, slow. "Go." She moved. The first obstacle was the wall, 12 feet of vertical wood with a rope on the near side. She hit the rope at a run and went up it in 4 pulls, swung a leg over the top, came down the other side fast enough that Solis, watching from the sideline, made an involuntary sound. She was already running to the second obstacle before anyone had adjusted their expectations. The low crawl under wire was 60 feet of wet clay and embedded gravel, and she went through it staying flat and fast the way people learned to do it when crawling upright got you killed. She was through in 40 seconds. She could hear boots moving beside the course, people repositioning to watch. The water obstacle was a chest-deep channel, 8 feet wide, with rope lines above and a cargo net on the exit wall. She went in without breaking stride, grabbed the rope line, crossed hand over hand while her body cut through the water, hit the net, climbed it, rolled over the top platform, and dropped to the dirt on the other side. Weighted carry. 80 pounds in a sandbag, 200-meter run, drop and return. Her shoulders had carried more in worse conditions. She ran it. Rope climb. 30 feet. She went up in controlled movement, touched the marker, came back down controlled. The descent was where people blew out grip strength if they got reckless about it. The last sequence was the 4-obstacle combination: a tunnel crawl, a balance beam run over a water pit, a tire course, and a sprint finish across 50 meters of open ground. She hit the finish line. The stopwatch clicked. The field went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people being considerate. The specific quiet of people who have just seen something they weren't expecting and haven't yet processed it into words. Ramirez was looking at the stopwatch. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at the soldier with the tablet, who was looking at his screen with an expression that was trying very hard not to show anything. "What's the time?" someone asked. It was Solis, and his voice came out smaller than usual. Ramirez said the number. Nobody spoke for 3 full seconds. The post record, Ramirez's record, which Solis had helpfully mentioned the night before, was 22 minutes and 40 seconds. Mara's time was 21 minutes and 8 seconds. Ramirez walked toward the finish line. He stopped about 6 feet away from her and looked at her with an expression that had moved well past the comfortable certainty he'd walked in with. She could see him rebuilding something behind his eyes. "Where did you train?" he said. She caught her breath evenly. "Coronado." The word landed like a stone dropped in still water. She watched it travel outward through the assembled soldiers, a shift, almost physical, in how they were standing. Coronado was Bud's. Coronado was the place where the Navy made its hardest things. You didn't mention it casually. You didn't mention it as background noise. The people who trained there understood that, which was why the ones who had done it almost never brought it up at all. Ramirez's jaw tightened slightly, then released. "That explains the water obstacle," he said. It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement she was going to get from him right now, and she understood that. She nodded once. "Full schedule today?" she asked. "Intel brief at 0800. Tactical review at 10. Range work this afternoon. Then I'll see you at 0800. She walked back toward the equipment rack, and behind her the squad began talking again, but the frequency was different now. Something in the morning had shifted. She'd expected the physical test. What she was more interested in was what came next. The briefings, the operational patterns, the small procedural habits that revealed how a unit really functioned when they thought nobody important was watching. That was where the actual work began. The intelligence brief at 0800 was held in a windowless room in the operations building, and Colonel Harold Decker ran it with the kind of efficient authority that came from decades of practice. He was in his late 50s, lean in the way that service members who never stopped moving stayed lean, with gray cropping at his temples and eyes that cataloged a room the moment he entered it. He acknowledged Mara with a single nod when she sat down, then proceeded to ignore her existence in the way senior officers ignored subordinates they were choosing to evaluate by watching rather than questioning. The brief covered active training scenarios, unit readiness metrics, and logistical movement schedules for the next rotation cycle. Mara sat at the back of the room, notepad open, and wrote nothing. She watched the room instead, where people looked when certain information came up, how the body language shifted around specific topics, who was comfortable and who was slightly not. There was a logistics specialist named Fenton who sat to the right of the room's center and had the habit of checking his watch at odd intervals. Not the way people checked for time, but the way people checked for time when they were waiting for something specific. She wrote his name in her head. There was Commander Nathan Hayes, introduced briefly at the start as the senior tactical officer, who asked 3 questions during the brief and each time angled the questions toward force movement schedules with a specificity that was technically within his authority to ask, and yet somehow felt slightly off-axis from what the brief was actually covering. She wrote his name in her head, too. After the brief, in the corridor, Ramirez fell into step beside her without being invited. She'd expected that. "You didn't take notes," he said. "I retain better without them." He walked with her for a moment in silence, considering that. "The intel officer said your clearance level came in through SOCOM channels." "Did he?" "Not Joint Ops Coordination clearance. Something higher." Mara kept walking. "Clearances get routed through a lot of channels." "That's not really an answer." "No," she agreed. "It's not." He stopped walking. She took 2 more steps and stopped as well, turning back to face him. He was studying her with the direct, assessing look of someone who had spent years reading people in high-stakes environments and trusted his own read. "You're not just here to observe," he said. "My orders say—" "I know what your orders say. I've read your orders. They're very clean, very official." He paused. Clean the way things get when someone spent time making sure they were clean. She held his gaze, said nothing. "There was someone here before you," Ramirez said. His voice dropped, not dramatically, but noticeably. 7 months ago, Army CID. He was here for 11 days and then he wasn't. Officially, he was reassigned. Nobody told us where." She didn't move. "He'd been asking questions," Ramirez continued, "about scheduling leaks, about operational information appearing where it shouldn't. 3 months before he arrived, we had a training exercise that went sideways. Nobody got killed, but it was close. The timeline we reconstructed afterward suggested someone had passed our route information outside the base before we deployed. The corridor was empty. The ventilation hum above them was steady. "What was his name?" Mara said. "Agent Caldwell. Marcus Caldwell." He watched her face carefully. "You know that name?" "I'd like to see the incident report from that exercise." "You didn't answer my question." She looked at him steadily. "The incident report, Sergeant. Can you get it to me?" He studied her for another moment. Then something settled in his posture. Not surrender, but decision. He'd made a choice about how to proceed. "I'll have it on your desk in an hour," he said. She nodded, started walking again. "Lieutenant." She stopped. "I owe you something," Ramirez said. "For this morning. I had you wrong." She turned halfway. "You were protecting your people. There's nothing wrong with that. I was protecting my assumption about who you were. That's different." She considered that for a moment. "Most people never figure out that distinction. You figured it out in about 12 hours. That's not nothing, Sergeant." She left him in the corridor, and behind her she could hear him standing very still for a long moment before his boots started moving again. The incident report was on her desk in 40 minutes, not an hour. Ramirez was making a point about how he operated when he'd committed to something. She read it twice. The training exercise in question, a nighttime vehicle movement through a simulated contested corridor, had been compromised before it began. Roadside charge emplacements, part of the opposing force scenario, had been positioned along the route with a specificity that went beyond standard OP4 planning. The after-action review had documented this as anomalous. The inquiry that followed found nothing conclusive. The inquiry had been led by Commander Nathan Hayes. She sat with that for a while. Then she pulled out the personal notebook she'd kept since Coronado, the kind that wasn't connected to any network, that didn't sync to any server, and she wrote two names side by side. Fenton. Hayes. Below that she wrote a question she already suspected the answer to. Who ran the inquiry that cleared the inquiry? Outside her window, Fort Redstone moved through its afternoon routines, trucks crossing the parade ground, a formation jogging past in the distant crack of range work to the south. It looked from the outside exactly like what it was supposed to be. That was the thing about installations like this. The surface was always busy, always purposeful, always reassuring. The danger was never on the surface. It was in the spaces between the routines, the gaps in the schedules, the doors that were unlocked when they should be locked, the information that moved from a classified briefing room to somewhere it had no business being. The danger was in the person who sat in the right meetings and understood exactly which pieces mattered and how to get them out without tripping an alarm. She turned a page in her notebook, began building the picture, and 3 buildings away, in the communication section of the operations building, a personal cell phone, the kind that wasn't supposed to be inside the facility perimeter at all, received a short text message. She's asking about the Caldwell case. The reply came back in under a minute. Move the timeline up. The reply came back in under a minute, and whoever sent it had no idea that 3 time zones away, inside a Naval Special Warfare Command secure server, a flag had just been triggered on a monitored cell frequency operating inside a restricted installation perimeter. Mara didn't know about that flag yet either. What she knew was that her notebook had 2 names in it, a dead investigator's case file on her desk, and a text message she hadn't seen but whose existence she could feel, the way experienced operators felt things. Not through evidence, not yet, but through the accumulation of small wrongnesses that the brain assembled before the conscious mind caught up. She closed the incident report and sat with the quiet for a moment. Then she put on her boots and went to find Ramirez. He wasn't in the operations building. He wasn't in the barracks or the motor pool. She found him eventually at the eastern fence line, standing alone near a gap in the tree cover where the installation's perimeter dropped down toward a dry wash. He was looking at nothing in particular with the focused attention of a man thinking hard about something he hadn't resolved. "Walk with me," she said. He fell in beside her without asking where they were going, which she noted. They walked along the fence line for 100 meters before she spoke again. "The after-action review from the November exercise," she said. "The one that went sideways. Who conducted the inquiry?" "Hayes." "And the inquiry found nothing." "Correct." "Who appointed Hayes to run the inquiry?" Ramirez was quiet for 3 steps. "Colonel Decker." "And the CID agent, Caldwell, who was he reporting to during his 11 days here?" "I don't know the full chain. He reported to someone at the Criminal Investigation Command level. He told me he was working a tip about information leakage connected to that exercise." "Did he tell you what the tip was, or where it came from?" "No." Ramirez's jaw shifted. "He was careful. I got the impression he'd already been burned once by talking to the wrong person." "What was your read on him?" "Thorough, quiet. He didn't make assumptions out loud." Ramirez glanced sideways at her. "A little like you, actually." She didn't respond to that. "What happened the week he disappeared?" she said. "He was here Tuesday, gone by Thursday. Sergeant Major told us he'd been reassigned urgently. No farewell, no handoff, no explanation." He paused. "The Sergeant Major seemed uncomfortable when he told us. Didn't make eye contact. Has anyone heard from Caldwell since?" Ramirez stopped walking. She stopped too, and they stood facing each other beside the fence with the afternoon wind moving through the dry brush on the other side. "No," he said, "and I looked, discreetly, about 2 months after he left. Asked a contact at Fort Hood who'd worked with Army CID before." He paused. My contact said Caldwell was listed as on administrative leave. Indefinite. Did that strike you as unusual? Agents don't go on indefinite administrative leave in the middle of active investigations. No, she said, they don't. He was watching her now with the particular intensity of someone who had been sitting with a problem for months and had just recognized someone who might know something they needed. What do you actually know about Caldwell? I know that what you just described is consistent with an agent who either went dark voluntarily to protect an investigation or was removed from one to protect something else. Which is it? She started walking again. That's one of the things I'm here to find out. He caught up to her in 2 strides, and they walked in silence for a moment, the fence line turning south toward the range. You said I had you wrong this morning, Ramirez said, at the course. You said that. I didn't correct it. Is there anything about your assignment you can actually tell me? She thought about it. Not performing the consideration, actually doing it, running the calculus of what was useful to share and what wasn't, what it would cost and what it might return. I can tell you that the information leak you identified is real, she said. I can tell you that it predates the November exercise. And I can tell you that the people responsible for it have had months to build cover and establish patterns that look normal from the inside. She glanced at him. You've been looking in the right direction. You've just been looking alone. He absorbed that without reacting visibly. That was one of the things she'd already cataloged about him. He received information the same way, whether it was good or bad news, processed it inward, and only showed the product of the processing when he was ready. What do you need from me? He said. Access, your observations, and the ability to move through this installation without people wondering why you're with me. That last part might be harder than you think. Half the unit already knows you ran Ramirez's course and beat his time. The other half will know by dinner. Will that make them trust me or resent me? He was quiet for a moment. Depends on the person. Solis is already on your side. He respects results. There are 2 or 3 others in the squad who'll come around fast. He paused. There are also a few who are going to dig in harder. Some people don't revise. And Hayes? The name landed between them like something dropped deliberately. Ramirez took 2 steps before he answered. Hayes has been at this installation for 14 months. He knows every system, every schedule, every security rotation. He's good at his job on the surface. He stopped again. But there have been moments, small things, the kind you can't write a report about, where his questions ran ahead of where the briefing was going, like he already knew the answer and was asking to establish that he'd asked. You noticed that. I've spent 12 years reading rooms. He looked at her directly. It's what I do. Then we're both doing the same thing, she said. They stood at the southern edge of the fence line where it curved back toward the main installation, the range to their left, and the operations buildings visible ahead. All right, Ramirez said. It wasn't agreement to something specific. It was the sound of someone accepting the direction a situation was moving. Tonight, she said, I need the personnel movement logs from the past 6 weeks. Specifically, anyone who had access to the secure communications room during non-standard hours. I can get those. Without triggering a record of the request? He almost smiled. It wasn't a full smile. More the corner of one side of his mouth acknowledging that the question was reasonable. Yeah, I know a way. Good. She started back toward the buildings. And Ramirez. Yeah. Don't tell anyone what we talked about. Not your squad, not the sergeant major, nobody. Understood. Including Solis. He paused at that, and she knew why. Solis was the person he trusted most in the immediate unit, the one relationship that made institutional environments survivable. She was asking him to operate without that safety line. Understood, he said again. This time, it cost something to say it. Oh, the tactical review at 1000. The following morning was the first time Mara sat in the same room as Commander Nathan Hayes for an extended period, and she used every minute of it. Hayes was 47, which she'd confirmed from the personnel file she'd pulled the previous evening. He had the build of a man who had once been in serious physical condition and maintained just enough of it to avoid comment. Broad shoulders, a thickening at the midsection that his uniform accommodated but didn't hide, hands that were still large and capable looking. His face was the kind of unremarkable that worked well for a certain type of intelligence, the kind that let you sit in rooms and absorb information without drawing attention to the absorption. He ran the tactical review efficiently. He knew his material. He asked good questions of the unit NCOs and processed their answers in a way that looked like genuine analytical engagement. If you were watching from outside, you saw a competent senior officer doing his job. Mara watched from inside. The review covered 3 active training scenarios and the scheduling matrix for the next 6 days. When Sergeant Delacroix, the operations NCO, ran through the vehicle movement schedule for Thursday's convoy exercise, Hayes asked 3 clarifying questions. All 3 were about route specifics. All 3 were framed as force protection concerns. All 3 were the exact categories of information that had appeared in anomalous contexts before the November exercise. After the review, people moved toward the coffee station and the corridor, doing the informal recalibration that happened after structured events. Mara stayed seated and wrote 2 lines in her notebook. When she looked up, Hayes was standing beside the table. "Lieutenant Voss," he said, pleasantly, without warmth. "Commander?" "Settling in all right? Fort Redstone can be a bit sparse for visitors used to fleet environments." "I've worked in sparse," she said. "Of course." He pulled out the chair across from her. Ramirez's chair from the mess hall 2 nights ago, she noted, same positioning, and sat in it with the ease of a man who was comfortable anywhere. "I've been looking at your file." "That's your prerogative. Joint Operations Coordination is a fairly broad mandate. I want to make sure we're supporting your work appropriately." He folded his hands on the table. They were steady. "Is there anything specific you're focused on?" She held his gaze. "General operational rhythm. How the unit integrates cross-service communication. Nothing that should require special accommodation." "Good." He nodded slowly. "I only ask because we've had a few outside observers over the past year, and the ones who come in with narrow focus sometimes create friction they don't intend. People get uncomfortable when they feel like they're being studied rather than supported." "I understand that." "The unit functions well because there's trust," he said. "That trust is built over time, and it's fragile in the way all trust is fragile. People who come in from outside, even with good intentions, can disrupt it without realizing." She let a beat of silence pass before she answered, because silence was information, and she wanted to see what he did with it. "I appreciate the context, Commander," she said. "I'll be careful." He studied her for just a half-second longer than a casual conversationalist would. Then he stood, smoothed his uniform, and offered a professional smile. "Anything you need, my door is open." He walked out. She watched him go. Her hands, beneath the edge of the table where he couldn't see them, had been completely still the entire time. Shit. The personnel movement logs were on a USB drive tucked inside a technical manual on Ramirez's desk when Mara arrived at 2100. He was sitting in his office, a small room off the squad bay, barely big enough for a desk and a filing cabinet, reading what looked like an equipment requisition form, but holding it at the angle of a man who wasn't reading it. She picked up the drive without comment and sat in the single chair across from his desk. "Anything jump out when you pulled them?" she said. 3 entries. He set down the requisition form. Fenton, the logistics specialist. He had access to the secure comms room on 4 occasions in the past 6 weeks. 2 of those were during non-standard hours. One at 0615, one at 2145. Both times he signed in as conducting routine equipment checks. Was he scheduled for equipment checks? His maintenance rotation is on Wednesdays. Both of those entries were on Mondays. She turned the drive over in her fingers. Who else? Hayes has standard access, so his entries don't flag as unusual by themselves. But twice in the past month, his access log shows him entering the room within 20 minutes of Fenton's departure. He paused. "I don't know if that means anything." "It might mean they're careful," she said. 2 people in the same room at the same time is a risk. Sequential access with a gap between them is much harder to flag in a pattern review." She looked at him. "Did you pull Fenton's physical description?" 29, specialist, about 5'10", medium build, unremarkable. He's been here 8 months. Came from a supply unit at Fort Bliss." He picked up a paper from his desk. "I pulled his performance evals too. Nothing notable. Good worker, follows procedures, stays off the radar." "Staying off the radar is a skill," Mara said. "I know." He looked at the ceiling for a moment. "I've interacted with Fenton maybe half a dozen times. He's the kind of guy you don't remember after you walk away. You know the type. The best assets are always the type you don't remember." Ramirez looked at her at that word, assets, and let it sit there. He's not just a leaker, she said. If the pattern holds, Fenton is a courier. Physical information out of the secure environment. Hayes provides the access window and the intelligence value. Fenton provides the movement. She set the drive on his desk. But they're not operating alone. Someone outside the installation is running this. Fenton can move information out the gate on his person, and nobody flags it because he doesn't look like anything. But the information has to have somewhere to go. Do you know who's receiving it? Not yet. That's the piece that was missing from the Caldwell investigation. She stood. I need to be able to get into the secure comms room. Ramirez was quiet for a moment. That requires commander-level authorization or above. Or a security clearance that outranks the authorization requirement. He looked at her again with that recalibrating expression she was becoming familiar with. The expression that said, I keep thinking I know the ceiling on what you can do, and you keep moving the ceiling. I'll need your actual clearance level, he said, in writing. You'll have it tomorrow morning. She moved to the door. Don't access those logs again. Once is investigative, twice is a pattern someone might notice. Got it. And Ramirez. She paused at the door. Fenton checked his watch 3 times during this morning's briefing. 2 of those times came within 60 seconds of Hayes asking about route specifics. I don't think it was coincidence. He stared at her. How did you notice that from the back of the room? She didn't answer that. She went back to Building 4 in the dark, moving along the pathways without using her flashlight, and the installation settled into its nighttime rhythms around her. The distant generator hum, the perimeter lights casting their orange circles on the pavement, a lone MP truck making its slow circuit along the outer road. In her room, she uploaded the drive contents to her encrypted tablet and began cross-referencing the access log timestamps against the signal's intelligence summary. She'd been sent from her actual command chain the day before her arrival. The summary was 4 pages long and had been classified at a level that meant most of the people at Fort Redstone didn't know it existed. It cross-referenced a specific series of cellular transmissions originating from inside the installation perimeter over the past 5 months. The transmissions were short, under 30 seconds each, and had been routed through a commercial relay that made them look like standard network traffic. Someone had spent real effort on the routing architecture. That level of tradecraft didn't come from a bored logistics specialist working alone. She cross-referenced the transmission timestamps against the access log. 6 matches in the past 5 weeks. Fenton's Monday access at 0615 matched a transmission that had occurred at 0638. His 2145 access matched a transmission at 2159. The picture was getting clearer. The problem was that a clearer picture also meant the people making it had been doing this long enough to be good at it. They would have contingency behavior, warning signals, abort protocols, fallback positions. If they were monitoring for an investigation, and the text message she didn't yet know about had already told them someone was asking about Caldwell, then the timeline she was working with had just compressed. She didn't know that yet, but she could feel it in the way the air of an operation changed when the opposition started moving. She closed the tablet and sat in the dark for a while thinking about Marcus Caldwell, about what he'd found before he disappeared, about whether disappearing had been his choice or someone else's. Then she made herself stop thinking about it, because that kind of thinking could make you tentative, and tentative got people hurt. She set her watch for 0430 again and lay down without taking her boots off. The morning of the second full day brought a change in the unit's temperature that she noticed before she could explain it. It wasn't anything she could point to directly. The mess hall ran at the same time. PT formation was the same head count. The morning brief had the same structure. But there was something in the quality of the attention people were paying that had shifted, a slightly heightened alertness, like a room where a window had been opened and everyone had unconsciously adjusted to the new air. She sat through the morning brief and watched Hayes in her peripheral vision. He was performing his routine with the same competence as always, but twice he glanced toward the back of the room where she sat, and both times he pulled the glance back too quickly for it to be casual observation. He knew something had changed. She didn't know how he knew, but he did. After the brief, Solis caught up to her in the corridor. He fell into step beside her in the loose, slightly aggressive way of someone who'd been building up to a conversation. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You're already doing it." Sergeant Ramirez has been different since yesterday afternoon. Like, different focused, the kind of different that happens before something goes sideways on an op. He looked at her sideways. You wouldn't know anything about that. I wouldn't know anything about that, she confirmed. Solis walked another 10 steps in silence. For what it's worth, he said, whatever is happening, the guys in the squad trust Ramirez. Wherever he's pointing, we follow. That's good to know. I'm not just saying it. I mean, if you needed the squad for something, hypothetically, they'd move. She stopped walking. He stopped too, half a step later, and turned to look at her. How many of them? She said. He blinked, not expecting the directness. All of them. Maybe. He paused. Definitely 5. Who's the exception? He was quiet for a moment. Corporal Wages. He came up through Hayes's last unit, Fort Hood, before here. They've got history. She filed that. Solis. Yeah. This conversation didn't happen. He nodded once, quickly, with the self-conscious energy of someone who had been useful and knew it and was trying not to show that he knew it. She walked away and left him standing there. The range work that afternoon was live fire, and Mara had been authorized to participate at her own discretion. She chose a lane at the far end of the qualification range, a position that was slightly removed from the main squad activity, and gave her a sight line back toward the range control tower without being obvious about it. She ran the qualification course at a level that was good without being conspicuous, expert rated, which was solid but not unusual for a naval officer. What she was actually doing was watching Fenton, who was acting as a range safety NCO for the afternoon, moving along the firing line, calling commands, doing the routine work of the role. But at 13:47, she watched him step away from the line during a ceasefire interval and take out his phone. Personal phones were prohibited on the range. The prohibition was standard across all military ranges for a combination of operational security and focus reasons. It wasn't absolute in every situation, and some NCOs ignored it when call volume was low. But a logistics specialist acting as range safety on an active firing line had no business reason to be on a personal phone. He stood about 30 meters back from the firing line, partially obscured by the range control shed, with his back angled away from the main group. His conversation lasted approximately 90 seconds. He put the phone away, returned to the line, and called the resume command like nothing had happened. She filed the time. 13:47. She would check it against the transmission log later. The range session ended at 1600 and the unit reformed at the vehicle park for equipment cleanup. She moved through this cleanup area without drawing attention, checking in with Ramirez at the equipment rack with the casual proximity of someone confirming a logistical detail. Phone call, she said quietly. Range, 13:47. He didn't look at her directly. Copy. Cross-reference the log. Tonight. She moved on before anyone noticed the exchange, and that was when she felt it again. That pressure shift in the air, the sense of something moving that wasn't visible yet. She turned it over in her mind while the unit ran through its evening routine, trying to find the shape of it. It felt like acceleration, like something that had been operating at a careful, controlled pace had just been told to move faster. She was walking back toward Building 4 when her encrypted satellite communicator, the one registered to her actual command, not the Joint Ops Coordination cover, vibrated once in her pocket. She ducked into a maintenance alcove between two buildings and checked the message. It was 4 lines from a handler she'd never met in person, whose name she'd only ever seen in print. SIGINT flagged increased transmission frequency from Fort Redstone source. 7 transmissions in past 36 hours. Previous baseline was 1 per week. Assessed source believes they are under investigation. Recommend caution. Subject may attempt operational action before exposure. Stand by for further. 7 transmissions in 36 hours. She read the message twice, committed it to memory, and deleted it. Someone had told them she was asking about Caldwell, and they'd responded by going into a kind of controlled panic, sending more information, faster, possibly trying to complete whatever they were working on before the window closed. Accelerating operations when you felt compromised was a known pattern. It was also the point at which operations historically went wrong, for both sides. She put the communicator away and stood in the maintenance alcove for a moment in the dark, running the timeline. She needed the secure comms room access. She needed it before they moved whatever they were moving. And she needed it without tipping Hayes, who was almost certainly watching for exactly the kind of action she was about to take. Down the access road, the lights of the operations building threw yellow rectangles across the pavement, And somewhere inside that building, in a communications room that was supposed to be one of the most secure spaces on the installation, something was running that had no business running at all. She pulled out her notebook, opened to the page with the two names, and wrote a single word beneath them. Tonight. She was inside the operations building by 22:30. Not through the front entrance. That would have required signing in with the duty NCO, creating a timestamp, leaving a record. She used the maintenance corridor on the building's north side, accessed through a utility door whose lock was keyed to a clearance level she technically held but hadn't disclosed to anyone at Fort Redstone. The corridor smelled like electrical conduit and old carpet, and the lighting was the dim blue-white of emergency strips running along the baseboard. She moved through it without a flashlight. The secure communications room was on the building's second floor, interior-facing, no windows. Getting to it meant passing the duty desk on the main floor, which had one NCO on watch at this hour. She'd confirmed the rotation 2 days ago, and then taking the east stairwell up. The duty NCO was a young corporal who had the night watch habit of keeping his attention on his phone under the desk, which was a security lapse she'd noted and chosen not to report because it was useful to her right now. She paused at the stairwell door and listened. The building had the particular nighttime quiet of an active installation at rest. HVAC running, distant generator, the faint sound of a television somewhere on the floor above. She went up the stairs in the measured pace of someone who belonged, which was the only pace worth using in a situation like this. Running attracted attention. Hesitating attracted more. The secure comms room door had a keypad entry and a card reader. She used the card first, then the code. The code she'd pulled from a system she shouldn't have been able to access from her cover position, which was why she hadn't mentioned it to Ramirez. Some things were better demonstrated than explained. The door clicked open. She stepped inside and pulled it shut behind her. The room was approximately 400 square feet of equipment racks, workstations, and cable management systems. The main communications array was against the far wall, encrypted terminal, frequency management boards, satellite uplink hardware, and the status lights across the rack were running their standard overnight patterns. Everything looked exactly as it should look, which meant either nothing was wrong or whoever was running something wrong was very good at making it look normal. She moved to the primary terminal and sat down. The login prompt was active, waiting. She used her SOCOM access credentials. The ones that weren't in her cover file. The ones that existed 3 layers deeper in a system that the people who ran this installation didn't know she could reach. And the terminal opened. She didn't have long. The access log for this room would show her entry the moment she authenticated, and if Hayes or anyone connected to him had set up a monitoring alert, which she would have done in their position, the alert would trigger in minutes. She had to work fast, and she had to work without leaving traces that told them what she'd found. She pulled the outbound transmission logs for the past 90 days. The legitimate traffic was what she expected. Routine encrypted communications, scheduling updates routed to theater command, standard administrative traffic. She skimmed it and moved to the anomalies. There were 9 of them. 9 outbound transmissions that had been routed through the standard system architecture but flagged at the origin node as low-priority administrative traffic, the category that received the least scrutiny and routine log reviews because it generated the most volume. Someone had figured out that the best place to hide a signal was inside the noise floor of boring institutional communication. She pulled the first anomaly. A transmission from 14 weeks ago routed to a commercial relay address that resolved to a data forwarding service registered in a jurisdiction that made tracing difficult. The content of the transmission itself was encrypted at a level she couldn't crack in the time she had, but the metadata was intact: timestamp, origin authentication, packet size. The packet size was consistent with a compressed document. She pulled the next anomaly. Same relay address, different timestamp. Larger packet. By the 5th anomaly, the pattern was clear enough to hold up in any counterintelligence review. Same relay, same encoding structure. Escalating packet sizes consistent with increasingly detailed information being transmitted as the source got more comfortable with the method. The 6th anomaly was different. The relay address was the same, but there was a second destination embedded in the transmission header, a secondary routing tag that had been partially overwritten, as if someone had made a mistake and tried to correct it. She spent 40 seconds looking at the partial address, committing it to memory the way she'd learned to commit partial information at Coronado, when the instructors made you memorize grid coordinates once and then took the paper away. The partial address resolved, as much as it could, to something that looked like a military routing code. Not commercial, not foreign, military. She sat with that for 10 seconds, which was all she could afford. Then she closed out of the transmission log, cleared her authentication session, wiped the terminal's access cache using a utility she'd loaded from a personal drive, and stood up. Her hands were steady. Her pulse was elevated. She could feel it in her temples. But her hands were steady, which was the thing that mattered. She was at the door when her satellite communicator vibrated. She stopped, pulled it out. The message was 2 lines from the same handler as before. The agent picked up outbound transmission from installation 6 minutes ago. Not you. Source is active. They're moving something tonight. 6 minutes ago. She had been in this room for 14 minutes. The transmission had originated while she was sitting at the terminal. She ran the logic in 2 seconds. If Fenton was the courier and Hayes was the source, one of them had just sent something while she was here, which meant either they didn't know she was here yet, or they knew exactly and were operating on a compressed timeline that didn't account for her being this far along. She needed to get out of this room, and she needed to find out which of those 2 things was true. She opened the door, stepped into the corridor, and nearly walked directly into Commander Nathan Hayes. I was in civilian clothes, dark trousers, a collared shirt, the off-duty presentation of a senior officer with no reason to be in the operations building at 2240. He had a coffee cup in one hand. He was 3 feet from the secure comms room door. They looked at each other. The pause lasted perhaps 2 seconds, which was an eternity in a situation like this, both of them making the same rapid calculation about what the other person's presence meant. Hayes recovered first, which told her something. He'd had more time to prepare for this moment than she had. "Lieutenant?" His voice was level. "Working late." "I needed to cross-reference some communication protocols," she said. She kept her own voice flat, professional, the kind of explanation you give when the explanation is supposed to be boring. "The daytime traffic in there makes it hard to concentrate." He nodded slowly. His eyes moved to the door she'd just come through, then back to her. "You have access to that room?" "My clearance level authorizes it." "I wasn't aware of that." "It's in my file." Another pause. He was thinking behind the stillness of his face, and she could almost track the thinking, running her against what he knew, what he suspected, what her presence here confirmed or didn't confirm. The coffee cup in his hand hadn't moved. "I was going to send a routine update to Theater Command," he said. "Couldn't sleep." "I just finished," she said. "It's all yours." She moved a step past him. He shifted just slightly, and for a moment she was in the space where either of them could move in a direction that changed the nature of the encounter. She felt it the way she'd felt dozens of threshold moments in worse places than this, the specific quality of suspended physics before something broke one way or another. Then he stepped aside. "Good night, Lieutenant." "Commander." She walked down the corridor toward the east stairwell at the same measured pace she'd come up with, and she didn't look back because looking back would tell him she was concerned about what he'd do, and she couldn't afford to tell him that. At the bottom of the stairs, she paused in the shadow of the stairwell door for 3 seconds, listening. No footsteps following, no sound of the comms room door reopening immediately. She went out through the maintenance corridor and into the night air. Her pulse was still elevated. Her hands were still steady. She walked back to Building 4 by a route that took her past the motor pool and added 4 minutes to the trip, which she used to think. Hayes had been going to the comms room at 2240 in civilian clothes to send a routine update. That was the story he'd assembled in the 2 seconds they'd looked at each other. It was a story that worked, barely, because senior officers did sometimes handle communications late when they couldn't sleep, and because nothing in his explanation was technically impossible. But the timing was the thing. The SIGINT flag had picked up a transmission 6 minutes before they'd met in that corridor. Either Hayes had already sent it and was returning to the room to do something else, or Fenton had sent it from somewhere else in the building, or there was a third person she hadn't yet identified in this chain. She needed Ramirez. She knocked on his door at 23:15, and he opened it within 10 seconds, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. "We have a problem," she said. He stepped back and let her in without asking questions. His room was small and orderly, with the specific neatness of someone who'd learned that organization in small spaces was a form of sanity maintenance. There were framed photos on the desk she didn't look at, a tactical manual open on the cot, a radio on the shelf running on low volume. She told him what she'd found in the comms room. She told him about the 9 anomalous transmissions and the partial secondary address. She told him about Hayes in the corridor. He sat on the edge of his cot and listened without interrupting, which was something most people couldn't actually do when they received information that changed things. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He saw you come out of that room. Yes. So he knows you've been in there. He knows I have access. He doesn't know what I found. Does it matter? If he thinks you're onto him, he'll move faster. Yes. She sat in the chair at his desk. That transmission 6 minutes before I met him in that corridor, that was either him or Fenton. Either way, it means they're operating on a compressed schedule already. Running into me in that corridor might accelerate it further, or it might make them go to ground and wait. Which do you think? She thought about Hayes' face in the corridor, the steadiness of it, the recovery time. He's not the kind of person who goes to ground, she said. He's the kind who decides the best defense is moving through the problem before the problem catches up. Ramirez rubbed the back of his neck. There's a full operational exercise in 48 hours. Thursday's convoy exercise. 12 vehicles, 2 squads, a route through the training corridor that Hayes has the full schedule on. She looked at him. If someone wanted to pass detailed operational information about a real conditions training event with live ammunition, a specific route, and a timed departure schedule, Ramirez said, the window to do it would be the next 36 hours. The room was quiet, except for this low radio static. Who approved the exercise parameters, she said. Hayes co-authored the planning document with Colonel Decker. He paused. Decker signed off. Hayes built the route matrix. Does Decker know about the Caldwell case? I was the one who brought Caldwell in. He commissioned the investigation. Ramirez's expression shifted, which means either Decker has no idea what Hayes has been doing under his authorization, or the investigation Decker commissioned was designed to identify what Caldwell had found before Caldwell could report it. She said it evenly, without drama, because the possibility had been sitting in the back of her mind since she'd read the inquiry chain and found Hayes' name running the review that cleared Hayes. I don't think Decker is involved. The profile doesn't fit and the access pattern doesn't support it, but we need to be careful around him until we're certain. How careful? Until tomorrow morning we don't tell him anything. Ramirez looked like he wanted to push back on that. She could see it in the slight forward movement of his shoulders. And then he pulled it back. He was running the same logic she was and arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion. All right, he said. She stood. The convoy exercise. Then it be modified without going through Hayes? The route can be adjusted at the sergeant major level on safety grounds. It doesn't require commander sign-off if the change is classified as a terrain assessment update. Can you get that done tomorrow without it looking like an investigation? I can request a route safety review. I've done it before. It won't look unusual. He paused. But if Hayes is watching for exactly that kind of move, he will be. That's fine. She moved to the door. We want him to see the route review. We want him to think we're reacting to the transmission and trying to protect the convoy without understanding the full picture. If he thinks we're one step behind, he'll give us the one step we need. Ramirez looked at her for a moment with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the recalibration she'd become accustomed to, but something more like recognition. Like he was seeing something he'd suspected was there and was now confirmed. You've done this before, he said. It wasn't a question. Get some sleep, she said. Tomorrow is a full day. She left his room and walked back through the nighttime installation, and the base around her was quiet and apparently still. And somewhere inside it, 2 men who had been running something careful and patient for months were making decisions about how much time they had left. She was wrong about Hayes not going to ground. At 0615 the next morning, she received a message through the Joint Ops Coordination Channel, the cover channel, the one she was supposed to be using for her stated purpose, informing her that Commander Hayes had requested an emergency leave authorization effective that evening, citing a family medical situation. She read the message twice, standing in the corridor outside the morning brief room, and felt the specific cold clarity of a situation compressing faster than planned. He was running. Not panicked running. This was controlled, plausible, deniable. A family medical situation was the cleanest cover for a rapid departure from an installation without triggering security protocols. You couldn't hold a man on base when his family needed him without a specific legal order, and getting that order required going through a process that would take longer than the departure. She walked into the morning brief 3 minutes late and found her seat at the back without drawing attention. Hayes was at the front of the room running the brief as if nothing had changed, and the performance was good, smooth, authoritative, appropriately focused. But she watched him for 4 minutes and saw it. The slight compaction of his movements, the economy of gesture that came when someone was managing a lot of cognitive load below the surface and had to be careful not to let it break through. He was managing an exit timeline in his head while he briefed a convoy exercise he'd already decided he wouldn't be here to see. After the brief, she went directly to Ramirez in the equipment bay. Hayes put in for emergency leave, she said, effective tonight. Ramirez's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. He's leaving. He's leaving, which means whatever's in that convoy exercise schedule, whatever he's already passed or is about to pass, he wants to be off the installation before it gets used. She looked at the equipment rack between them. Where's Fenton right now? Logistics bay. He's running a supply inventory this morning. Is he alone? He's got a working party of 3. Other soldiers. She thought for a moment. We need to watch Fenton all day. Not surveillance, nothing that flags. Just someone who has a reason to be near the logistics bay and is paying attention. Solis, Ramirez said. You said you trust him. Completely. Tell him to stay near the logistics bay this morning. Give him a legitimate reason. Equipment check, supply coordination, anything. He'll want to know why. Tell him you'll explain later and mean it. She met his eyes. Can you do that? He trusts me, yeah. Good. She started moving. I need to brief Colonel Decker. Ramirez caught up to her in 2 steps. I thought we weren't telling him. The situation changed the moment Hayes requested emergency leave. Decker needs to know before Hayes walks out that gate, because once he's gone, our window to do this quietly closes. She pushed through the bay door into the morning sun. I'm not going to brief him on the full investigation. I'm going to give him enough to keep Hayes on the installation for 48 more hours. And if Decker is connected, then we'll know within about 2 minutes of me starting to talk. Colonel Harold Decker had the kind of office that told you something about the man, not the photographs on the wall or the unit crests on the shelf, but the desk. The desk was clear. Not performatively clear, but working clear, the surface of someone who processed everything that came in and moved it out, who had no patience for paper accumulation. A man who dealt with things. He looked up when she entered and dismissed his aide with a gesture before she'd said a word. Lieutenant Voss. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Sit down. She sat. She didn't build up to it. Commander Hayes requested emergency leave effective tonight, she said. I need you to delay the authorization for 48 hours. Decker looked at her steadily for a moment. That's an unusual request. The leave request is a cover for a departure that I believe is related to an active counterintelligence concern on this installation. The room was very quiet. That's a significant allegation, Decker said. Yes, sir, it is. Do you have something more specific than a leave request? She pulled the summary she'd prepared, 3 pages, handwritten, the key points only, and placed it on his desk. She'd written it at 0400 that morning, sitting at her room's small desk with her back to the door, and the window showing nothing but the exterior wall of the next building gray in the pre-dawn. Decker read it without expression. He read it slowly, which meant he was reading it carefully and not performing the reading for her benefit. When he finished, he turned back to the first page and read 2 sections again. Then he set it down. Marcus Caldwell, he said. You know the name. I commissioned his investigation. He went administrative leave before he could complete it. Decker's voice was even, but there was something working beneath it. I was told his personal circumstances required it. Who told you that? The pause that followed was one of the most informative pauses she'd encountered in the past 3 days. It lasted approximately 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds she watched Harold Decker's face move through something. Not guilt, not deception, but the particular expression of a man who has just understood that he has been managed and is experiencing the outrage and embarrassment of that understanding simultaneously. Hayes, he said. Hayes told me. She said nothing. Decker's hands, flat on the desk, pressed down once, then released. He looked at the 3 pages in front of him. "The leave authorization," he said. "I need 48 hours. "You'll have it." He picked up his desk phone. "I'll route it as a pending administrative review. It's within my authority, and it won't flag to Hayes as anything other than paperwork." He paused with the handset in his hand. "What else do you need?" "The Thursday exercise needs to run," she said. "Modified route, per the safety review Sergeant Ramirez is requesting this morning. I need Hayes to see the modified route. I need him to believe we're protecting the convoy without knowing the full picture." "A controlled feed." "Yes, sir." He looked at her with a different quality of attention now. The attention of a man who was recalibrating a situation he thought he understood and finding it considerably more complex than he'd known. "How long have you actually been investigating this installation, Lieutenant?" She met his gaze. "My orders are exactly what they say they are, sir." He held the look for a moment. Then he almost smiled, not warmly, but with the dry acknowledgement of a senior officer who recognized a non-answer delivered with precision. "Get out of my office," he said not unkindly. "I have a phone call to make." At 11:27, Solis sent a 2-word text to Ramirez on a personal phone. He moved. Ramirez found Mara in the operations building corridor. "Fenton left the logistics bay at 11:15, he said quietly. "Went to the vehicle park." Solis followed at a distance. Fenton spent approximately 8 minutes near the maintenance shed on the park's south side. Alone. The maintenance shed. South side has a dead angle from the security camera coverage. Ramirez's jaw was tight. Solis said he appeared to leave something, small, taped to the interior of a storage rack. She thought for 3 seconds. "We don't touch it. If it's a dead drop. If we touch it, we break the chain of evidence and we tip whoever is collecting that something changed. We leave it and we watch it." She looked at him directly. "Can Solis maintain observation on that shed without being obvious?" "He's been running equipment maintenance in the vehicle park all morning. It's legitimate." "Then he stays. Nobody else. And nobody approaches that shed." Ramirez nodded, but his expression was the expression of a man who was sitting on a significant amount of physical energy that wanted to move in a direction and was being told not to. "I know," she said. "You don't know what I was going to say. You were going to say that Fenton is right there and we could take him right now and pull everything out of him in an interview room." He was quiet for a beat. "That's not far off. And if we do that, we get Fenton and we lose Hayes. Hayes walks out the gate tonight on his emergency leave and disappears into whatever he's set up on the outside. And the person receiving that dead drop finds out within hours that Fenton was pulled and goes dark too." She shook her head. "We need all 3 or we don't have enough. Fenton talks, but he's a courier. He knows the method, not the network. Hayes knows the network." Ramirez let out a slow breath. "And the third person? Whoever collects the dead drop?" "That's the piece I don't have yet." "When do you expect to get it?" "Tonight, if the timeline holds." He looked at her for a moment. "And if it doesn't?" She didn't answer that immediately. The honest answer was that if the timeline didn't hold, Hayes left the installation and the operation went cold and Marcus Caldwell stayed on indefinite administrative leave wherever they'd put him, and the unit ran its convoy exercise on a route that had been passed to whoever was receiving the transmissions, and someone made decisions with that information that hurt people. "It'll hold," she said instead, because uncertainty was a luxury neither of them could afford right now. At 1400, Hayes's leave authorization came back as pending administrative review. Decker's aide delivered it in person to Hayes's office. Mara was in the corridor 40 feet away when it happened, not watching the door but watching the reflection in the window of the room across the hall. She saw the moment Hayes read it. The stillness that lasted 2 seconds longer than it should have. The controlled replacement of the stillness with a normal expression before he looked up at the aide and said something that made the aide nod and leave. He knew something was wrong. He just didn't know yet how wrong. At 16:30, a vehicle she didn't recognize, a civilian pickup truck, Texas plates, pulled into the visitor parking area outside the main gate and sat there with the engine running. The driver didn't get out. After 11 minutes, the truck left. Solis reported that during those 11 minutes, no one had approached the maintenance shed. But the security camera on the vehicle park's northeast corner had developed a technical fault at 16:18 and hadn't been reported to the duty NCO yet. She found that out at 1700, and the cold clarity came back, sharper this time. They weren't waiting for tonight. The collection was going to happen before the day was out, and someone on this installation had just blinded one of the cameras to give it cover, and that meant there was a third person she hadn't put a name to yet who had access to the installation's security system and had just used it. She called Ramirez on his personal phone. "The vehicle park," she said. "Now, both of us." "What happened?" "Camera fault on the northeast corner. Someone created a blind spot." 3 seconds of silence. "On my way," he said. She was already moving. The vehicle park in the late afternoon had the particular emptiness of a space between shifts. A few soldiers moving between vehicles, the maintenance shed visible at the south end, the broken camera on its pole at the northeast corner, staring at nothing with its small red fault light blinking. She and Ramirez converged from opposite directions at the maintenance shed, and she went in first, Ramirez at her back. The storage rack on the interior south wall was a steel shelving unit holding spare parts, cabling, and maintenance supplies. She moved to it and looked without touching, running her eyes across the lower shelves where a person could reach naturally and place something without crouching or drawing attention. There was nothing there. She stood back. The drop had already been collected. Ramirez was behind her, and she could feel the weight of that realization settling across both of them. The specific frustration of being one step behind, of the timeline having moved faster than they'd accounted for. "When did Solis step away from the park?" she said. "He went to the mess hall at 15:45, back at 16:10. Ramirez's voice was controlled. 15 minutes. The camera fault was logged at 16:18. The drop was collected in a 15-minute window. Someone knew Solis's pattern. She turned around. Or someone created the window deliberately. Camera fault at 16:18, Solis away from 15:45 to 16:10. The window opened before the camera failed. That's not coincidence, that's coordination. She looked at the rack one more time. There's a third person, Ramirez. Someone who can access the security system and knew the observation schedule. That's not Hayes, and it's not Fenton. He stared at her. Someone inside the operations center. Someone with access to camera controls and visibility on who's doing what in the vehicle park. She started moving. "We need the security system access log for the past 3 hours. That goes through the duty officer." "Who is it tonight?" He pulled out his phone, checked something. His face changed. "Corporal Wages," he said. Wages. The name Solis had given her 2 days ago. Came up through Hayes's last unit. Fort Hood, before here. They've got history. She looked at Ramirez. He looked back at her. "Get Solis," she said. "Right now. Tell him to find Wages and stay within eyeline. Don't approach, don't confront." Ramirez was already dialing. Outside the maintenance shed, the base moved through its late afternoon patterns, and somewhere in the building that housed the security systems and the duty station, a corporal who had come up through Hayes's last unit sat at a console that controlled what the cameras saw and didn't see, and the red fault light on the northeast camera blinked its patient, indifferent rhythm against the fading Texas sky. Ramirez was still on the phone when she moved. Not running, moving with the specific urgency of someone who understood that the difference between running and walking in a situation like this was the difference between alerting your target and arriving before your target knew to move. She covered the distance from the vehicle park to the operations building in 90 seconds, using the south access road where the foot traffic was lighter, and the sight lines from the security duty station were blocked by the communications annex. Ramirez caught up to her at the building's south entrance, phone away. "Solis has eyes on Wages," he said, falling into step beside her. "Duty station, second floor. He's alone." "How long has he been on shift?" "Since 1500. "So he was on this console when the camera fault happened?" "Yes." She pushed through the door. The operations building's ground floor was quiet at this hour. The day shift had turned over. The evening crew was settling in, the particular institutional lull of a shift change. They took the east stairwell, and she thought about the sequence while she climbed. Wages on the duty station, camera fault at 16:18, drop collected in the window. The sequence was tight, and it had worked, which meant it had been rehearsed. This wasn't the first time Wages had done this, which meant every previous dead drop in the past months had probably had the same architecture, a camera fault logged as technical malfunction, a window that looked accidental, a collection that left no trace. Clean, patient, built to survive a routine security review. The door to the second-floor security duty station was half open. She pushed it the rest of the way. Corporal Danny Wages was 24 years old and had the particular build of someone who had spent more time in front of screens than in the field. Not soft exactly, but not carrying the physical density of the combat soldiers she'd been working around for the past 3 days. He had sandy hair and a small scar on his chin, and he was sitting at the security console with a coffee cup at his elbow and a log form open on the desk beside the keyboard. He looked up when they entered. Something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly, but the fast recalibration of someone who had been expecting a different kind of evening. Sergeant Ramirez. His voice was steady. His hands, she noted, moved off the keyboard and settled flat on the desk. Ma'am. Corporal. Ramirez moved to the console. I need to pull the camera maintenance log for the past 4 hours. The log's current. Wages didn't move from his chair. Northeast vehicle park camera went down at 16:18. I filed the fault report. Maintenance is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Who filed the report? I did. It's in the system. When did you notice the fault? A pause. Small, but there. When I ran the hourly check at 16:20. Mara stepped around the left side of the console, so she was in Wages' peripheral vision rather than directly in front of him. He tracked her movement without turning his head, which told her his attention was divided and he was managing it. The camera feeds run on a continuous monitor, she said. A fault shows as a red indicator on the main board. That indicator would have appeared at 16:18. Your hourly check at 16:20 would have confirmed it, but you would have seen the indicator the moment it faulted. Wages looked at her directly for the first time. Yes, ma'am, I saw the indicator when it appeared. So you knew the camera was down at 16:18. Correct. But you logged the fault at 16:23 and filed it as discovered during the 16:20 check. The silence this time was longer. His hands, still flat on the desk, didn't move. Is there a discrepancy in the log? He said. His voice had gone carefully neutral in the way voices went when a person had decided to stop volunteering information and wait. I want to see the camera fault history, Ramirez said. Full log, past 90 days. Wages turned to the console and pulled up the log without being asked twice. It appeared on the screen, a long table of entries, dates, camera identifiers, fault codes, resolution timestamps. He scrolled to the top and stepped back from the console. Ramirez leaned in. Mara looked over his shoulder. She was counting. There were 9 camera fault entries on the Northeast vehicle park camera in the past 90 days, 3 on other cameras covering the south maintenance area. Each fault had lasted between 12 and 22 minutes. Each had been logged as discovered during a routine hourly check. Each had been filed by the same duty station ID. Wages' ID, 12 faults, all in camera positions covering the areas where a person moving through the vehicle park could avoid visual tracking. All during evening or early morning shift windows. All logged and closed cleanly with no investigation flags. Ramirez straightened up. He turned and looked at Wages with an expression that had moved well past professional neutrality. Stand up, he said. Wages stood. He was managing something internally. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the quality of stillness he was maintaining. And he was doing it with more composure than most 24-year-olds would have, which told her he'd been prepared for this possibility. Not this specific moment, but the category of moment. This is a security review, Ramirez said. You'll come with us. I want to know the basis. The basis is 12 documented camera faults in 90 days on coverage positions consistent with an active dead drop route, all filed by you, all during your shift windows. Ramirez kept his voice level and hard. That's the basis. Camera faults happen. It's old equipment. The same camera faulted 9 times in 90 days, Mara said. The maintenance contractor certified it as operational 41 days ago. The fault logs before that certification show 0 anomalies. Every fault in this log postdates that certification. Wages looked at her. Something shifted in his eyes. Not breaking, not yet, but the first acknowledgement that the position he'd been holding was no longer holding. I want legal representation before any further questioning. You'll have it, Ramirez said. Let's go, Todd. They put Wages in the small conference room on the first floor, and Ramirez stationed Solis at the door with instructions that read, as routine security rotation to anyone walking past. Mara went straight to Colonel Decker's office. He was still in the building. She'd confirmed that through his aide before coming upstairs. And when she walked in, he had a phone to his ear and the expression of a man who had been managing accelerating problems for the past 2 hours. He ended the call when he saw her face. "Tell me," he said. She told him. Wages, the camera logs, the dead drop architecture, the 12 faults. She put it in front of him in 4 minutes of clean, sequential information without commentary, the way she'd been trained to brief people who needed to act on what they heard. Decker listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment that wasn't uncertainty. It was the pause of a man organizing his next actions. "Hayes is still on the installation," he said. "His leave authorization is pending your review." "I know where it is. I put it there." He stood. "I want Hayes in a room in the next 20 minutes, not his office. Somewhere neutral. The security conference room on the north side is available." "Good." He picked up his phone and made a call that lasted 45 seconds. When he put it down, his jaw was set with the specific pressure of a man who was furious and managing it with professional discipline. "2 of my MPs are going to bring Hayes to that room, quietly, without explanation. When he asks, they'll tell him it's an administrative matter. He'll know it's not." "Yes." Decker looked at her steadily. "He'll know, and knowing won't help him." She nodded. "Lieutenant." He paused with his hand on the office door. "Who are you actually reporting to?" She held his gaze. "Joint Operations Coordination, sir, as my orders state." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who had commanded people for 25 years and could read the architecture of a non-answer with precision. "Of course," he said, and opened the door. Nathan Hayes walked into the security conference room at 1842 with the particular bearing of a man who had decided in the 60 seconds between being collected by the MPs and arriving here that the best performance available to him was calm authority. He sat across the table from Mara and Decker and crossed his hands on the surface in front of him. "I'd like to know what this is about," he said. Decker looked at him without expression. "Your leave request. There's been a family. The leave request is denied." Decker's voice was flat and final. "Sit down, Nathan." Hayes had already been sitting. The instruction was about something other than posture. He understood that, and it showed in the way he resettled. A small adjustment, a reorientation. "The 9 anomalous transmissions from the secure communications room," Mara said. She put a single sheet on the table between them, a summary of what she'd pulled from the terminal the previous night, formatted as a counterintelligence document. The routing architecture, the relay address, the packet sizes consistent with compressed operational planning documents. Hayes looked at the sheet. He looked at it for a long time. "I'd like a JAG officer present." "That's being arranged," Decker said. "Right now I want to hear you explain those transmissions." "I'm not going to explain anything without—" "The partial secondary routing address in the 6th transmission," Mara said, cutting through it, "resolves to a military network identifier. Not commercial, not foreign. A domestic military routing code." She paused. "That's the part that matters most. Not because it tells us where the information went, because it tells us it didn't go where you wanted us to think it went." Hayes looked at her now with something in his face she hadn't seen before. A careful, measuring attention, stripped of the social performance he'd been running since the first time they'd met in the comms room corridor. "You pulled that from the terminal last night," he said. "Yes." "You have access to the terminal that you didn't disclose to anyone at this installation." "My clearance level authorizes it." "What clearance level?" She didn't answer that. Hayes looked at Decker. "Harold, I want to be very clear. What's happening here is more complicated than it looks, and if you move forward without understanding the full picture, you're going to create a problem that is significantly worse than the one you think you're solving." Decker looked back at him. "Then give me the full picture." "I need JAG present for that." "You said that. JAG is coming." Decker leaned forward slightly. "In the meantime, you're going to sit in this room, and you're not going to make any calls, and you're not going to communicate with anyone outside this building. That's not a request." Hayes absorbed that with the stillness of a man running calculations behind an expression designed to reveal nothing. Then he looked at Mara again. "You found the partial routing address," he said. It wasn't a question. I did. And you think you know what it means? I think I know what it means. Something passed across his face then, not quite relief, not quite dread, but something that partook of both. She filed that. Then you understand, he said, that this is not what it appears to be. She looked at him steadily. What it appears to be, Commander, is 9 unauthorized transmissions of classified operational information through a commercial relay, a logistics specialist running physical information out of this installation using dead drops covered by a duty station corporal who manipulated the security camera system. She paused. Tell me what I'm missing. Hayes pressed his lips together, looked at the table, then back at her. I need JAG, he said, and then I'll talk. The JAG officer arrived from his on-post office at 1934, a captain named Osei, quick and compact, who took 15 minutes with Hayes behind a closed door before coming out and requesting a private word with Colonel Decker. Mara stood in the corridor and waited. Ramirez appeared at the far end of it and walked toward her. Fenton's been pulled, he said quietly. Security team picked him up at his barracks 20 minutes ago. How is he? Shaking. He asked for representation before anyone said a word, which means someone told him to say that if it ever happened. Hayes. Probably. Ramirez stopped beside her. Wages isn't talking either. Same thing. Representation. Nothing more. They were briefed on what to do if they got caught. She looked at the closed conference room door. That's professional tradecraft. That's not 3 soldiers who stumbled into something over their heads. Ramirez looked at the door too. What's Hayes saying in there? He told me the situation isn't what it appears to be. What does that mean? I don't know yet. She thought about the partial routing address, the military routing code, the thing that had made Hayes's face do something she hadn't been able to fully read. But the partial address I found in the 6th transmission routed to something inside the military network rather than outside it. That's the part I keep coming back to. Ramirez was quiet for a moment. You think he was running something authorized? I think there's a version of this where what Hayes was doing wasn't unauthorized disclosure of classified information, but was instead an operation that looks exactly like unauthorized disclosure, because that's what it was supposed to look like from the outside. She paused. And I think if that's true, the people who authorized it didn't tell Colonel Decker, and they didn't tell my command. And the information that went through that relay may have been designed to go where it went for reasons that have nothing to do with betraying this installation. Ramirez stared at her. A controlled feed. An operation inside an operation. She shook her head slightly. Or I'm wrong. And Hayes is a very composed man trying to construct a cover story complicated enough to buy him time. How do you tell the difference? The conference room door opened. Captain Osei came out, looked at Mara, and said, Commander Hayes is willing to make a statement. He's requesting that Lieutenant Voss be present and that whatever she's actually cleared for be confirmed before the statement begins. Mara and Ramirez exchanged a look. Give me 5 minutes, she said. She went to the end of the corridor and used her satellite communicator. The connection took 40 seconds to establish, which was longer than usual, and when her handler came on the line, the background noise suggested an office rather than a field position. Hayes is asking for a clearance confirmation, she said. A pause. What specifically? He found the partial routing address in the 6th transmission. He knows I pulled it from the terminal. He's making a statement and he wants my actual clearance confirmed first. A longer pause. How partial is the partial address? Enough to indicate military network routing rather than commercial or foreign. 3 seconds of silence that felt different from normal processing silence. Stand by, the handler said. She stood by for 90 seconds. Long enough that she shifted her weight once and looked at the wall. Then, confirm your clearance to Hayes as follows. And the handler read her a code phrase she had never heard before, which meant it was specific to this situation, which meant the situation was specific in a way her original briefing had not covered. She repeated it back. Disconnected. She walked back to the conference room and sat down across from Hayes again. Osei was at his client's left side. Decker was to her right. She said the code phrase. Hayes closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, the composure he'd been maintaining had shifted into something that looked for the first time like exhaustion. All right, he said. All right. He talked for 40 minutes. The operation had a name that Mara was not going to repeat outside a classified setting, and it had been running for 22 months, and it had been authorized at a level above Colonel Decker's knowledge, specifically because the installation itself was suspected of having an existing unauthorized disclosure network that the authorizing command wanted to use as a vehicle rather than neutralize immediately. Hayes had been placed at Fort Redstone to identify and map the external network, the people receiving the information outside the installation, by becoming the source that fed it. Everything he'd transmitted had been constructed information, accurate enough to look real, specifically designed to lead the external network's principals into positions where they could be identified and collected by a separate operation running outside the installation. Fenton and Wages were not his assets. They were the original leak network, the one that had existed before he arrived, the one that had been running operational information outside the base for reasons that connected to a foreign intelligence network operating through a commercial intermediary. He had inserted himself into their pattern as an additional source because it gave him visibility into their method, and eventually, their handler. Marcus Caldwell had arrived and begun investigating before Hayes could brief him into the operation through proper channels. The proper channels required a contact at Criminal Investigation Command who hadn't been table-read into the operation. By the time the right authorizations were assembled, Caldwell had gotten close enough to Hayes' activity that the only way to protect the operation was to pull Caldwell out of the installation before he inadvertently burned the external network that Hayes was mapping. Caldwell was not on indefinite administrative leave. Caldwell had been table-read into the operation 4 months ago and was currently working the external side of it from a position outside the installation. Hayes looked at Mara when he finished. The partial routing address you found in the 6th transmission. That's the military network node for the operations coordination cell. That's why I knew, when you told me you'd found it, that you'd actually found it. Not found noise and mistaken it for signal. The room was quiet. Decker had not moved for the past 20 minutes. He was sitting in the particular stillness of a man who was absorbing something significant and choosing not to perform his reaction while he was still inside it. The transmissions, Mara said, the 9 anomalous entries, those were yours. All 9, yes. But Fenton and Wages have also been using the same system. That's correct. Their traffic is embedded in the same access pattern because they were there first. My transmissions gave the external network a consistent cadence that matched their operational security expectations. If the cadence had changed when I arrived, it would have flagged. How many of the 12 camera faults were yours? Hayes shook his head. None. Wages has been running the camera manipulation for Fenton's physical drop since before I arrived. I mapped it, but I didn't run it. Touching their method would have risked breaking the pattern. She looked at the table for a moment. The convoy exercise, she said. Thursday. Hayes built the route matrix. I built it, yes. Hayes leaned forward. The route information I've been transmitting is constructed. It's accurate on the surface and operationally nonsensical underneath in ways that wouldn't be visible to someone without detailed knowledge of how we actually move. The external network has been receiving information they believe is actionable and acting on it, and the action trace is what the coordination cell has been using to map the network's decision infrastructure. And Fenton's physical drops? Real. That's the problem. Hayes' voice tightened slightly. Fenton has been passing actual operational information alongside the channel I was seeding. His traffic and mine share the same external contact point. His information is real. That's what Caldwell originally found. Fenton's network, not mine. And it's what needs to be stopped. She held that. You couldn't expose Fenton, she said, because exposing Fenton would expose the channel you were using and collapse the external mapping operation before it was complete. Correct? So you've been watching a soldier pass real information outside this installation for 14 months. While building the case that allows us to take down the network receiving it, yes. His voice had something in it now. Not defensiveness, but the particular cost of choices made under constraints. It's not a clean position to be in. I'm aware of that. Decker spoke for the first time in 20 minutes. His voice was completely controlled. Nathan, did you pull Caldwell out of this installation to protect the operation? Hayes looked at his commanding officer. Yes. Without telling me. The authorization didn't include your read-in. That was a command decision above both of us. Decker's hands, on the table, pressed flat in the same gesture Mara had seen in his office. Then released. When were you going to tell me? When the external collection was complete, Hayes paused. We were close. The last 3 transmissions were designed to bring the network's senior handler into a position where he could be identified. The timeline was weeks, not months. And my leave request? Decker's voice had an edge now. When Lieutenant Voss began pulling access logs, my coordination cell advised that the timeline was compromising. The leave request was an attempt to create a controlled withdrawal before the operation infrastructure was burned. He looked at Mara. I didn't know at that point what she'd already found. I thought she was 3 or 4 steps behind where she actually was. Mara said nothing to that. There was nothing useful to say. The next 4 hours were the kind of operational complexity that didn't resolve cleanly. Fenton was in a room with 2 criminal investigation agents who had arrived from San Antonio by 2100, and the interview was not going quickly. Fenton understood, at some level, that the story he'd been part of was more complicated than he'd known, and that complication was making him uncertain about what cooperation meant and who it would benefit. Wages had said almost nothing and was running out the legal consultation clock with the patience of someone who'd been told exactly how long to hold. Hayes was in a separate room working through a telephonic briefing with his coordination cell, with Osei present and Decker sitting in, and the conversation was going in the direction of operational continuity, whether the external network could still be mapped with the Fort Redstone infrastructure now partially exposed, or whether the damage assessment required a full stand-down. Mara was in the corridor. Ramirez found her there at 2140. He had 2 cups of coffee from somewhere and offered her one. She took it. You believe him, he said. It wasn't quite a question. The code phrase my handler gave me was specific to an operation in progress. You don't generate a code phrase for an operation that doesn't exist. She held the cup without drinking from it. Hayes is telling the truth about the architecture, whether every detail of his account is accurate, that I won't know until the coordination cell confirms it. What about Fenton? Fenton is real. His network is real. He's been passing genuine operational information to a foreign-connected commercial intermediary for as long as he's been at this installation, possibly longer. She looked at the cup. Hayes has been watching it happen and using it, and that's a position I understand the operational logic of and still find hard to sit with. Ramirez was quiet for a moment. Caldwell. Alive. Working the external side. I'll confirm that through my channel tonight. He let out a slow breath. Not relief exactly. More the release of a tension he'd been carrying for months without knowing its full shape. He just disappeared. He had to. If Fenton's network knew CID was investigating, they would have gone dark and the external mapping would have lost its thread. She finally drank from the cup. The coffee was strong and slightly bitter, and exactly what the moment required. Caldwell didn't know about Hayes either. He was pulled out before anyone told him. He spent 4 months thinking he'd been shut down by the institution, not protected by a parallel operation. That's a rough 4 months. Yes. Ramirez leaned against the wall beside her. The corridor was quiet at this hour, the building settling into its nighttime rhythms around them, and it felt briefly like the space between one thing ending and another beginning. The convoy exercise, he said, runs Thursday. Modified route per your safety review, which Hayes already knows about. We'll give his coordination cell the actual route modification so the controlled feed can be updated. Fenton won't be on the exercise. He'll be in an interview room. Wages won't be on the duty station. So the exercise runs clean. With one difference. She looked at the corridor. Hayes's coordination cell is going to use the exercise as the final bait. The route information, updated with the real modification, goes through the channel. If the external handler moves on it, positions assets, shifts resources, the coordination cell can triangulate the decision point. Ramirez absorbed that, using our convoy as the trigger. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. And if something goes wrong with the triangulation and the information gets used before they collect the handler, that's the risk the coordination cell is carrying. She looked at him. Your squad runs the exercise with the modified route. You'll have the real route parameters. Nothing they could have received through the channel will correspond to where you actually are. He nodded slowly. My guys will need to know something is running. You can tell them the exercise has a security component and they should follow the modified route exactly. That's enough. Solis is going to ask more questions than that. Solis can ask them after Thursday. Ramirez almost smiled. It was the same almost smile she'd seen in his office 2 nights ago, more genuine this time. He's going to be insufferable when he finds out how much he missed. He was useful. Tell him that. He'll want to hear it from you. She looked at him. Why? Because you're the one who noticed him. Before any of this, the first person to take him seriously in a professional context, actually take him seriously, not just tolerate him, was you, 2 days in. He shook his head slightly. That matters to a 22-year-old who's been trying to prove something. She didn't have an answer for that wasn't either dismissive or more personal than the moment called for, so she stayed quiet and drank her coffee. Lieutenant? Ramirez said. Voss, she said. At this point, he glanced at her sideways. Something shifted in his expression, not unprofessional, but human. Mara. She didn't correct. What happens to Hayes? That depends on what the coordination cell determines about the operation's current viability. If it can continue in modified form, Hayes continues in some capacity. If it can't, he'll be pulled, and the whole thing goes into a classified after-action that nobody at this installation will ever read. And Fenton? Fenton cooperates or he doesn't. Either way, he's done at this installation and likely done in any capacity that involves a security clearance. She paused. Wages the same. They're young, Ramirez said. Not defending them. Observing. Fenton has been passing real operational information to a foreign-connected network for the better part of a year. Young doesn't cover that. She said it without harshness. It was simply true, and both of them knew it. Wages enabled it 12 times. Ramirez nodded. He looked at his coffee cup. I keep thinking about the November exercise, when we went out on that route and the Opfer knew exactly where we were going to be. Fenton's network. My people were out there. His voice didn't change pitch, but something in it tightened. We had live ammunition. We were moving through a simulated, contested route, and the opposition knew our timing and position because someone on my installation had sold it. He paused. Nobody got hurt. It was close. I know. I've been angry about that for 8 months and not being able to point at what made me angry. You can point at it now. He was quiet for a moment. Doesn't feel as clean as I thought it would. It never does. She finished her coffee and set the cup on the floor beside the wall and straightened up. Get some sleep tonight, she said. Thursday is a working day. He looked at her. You're going to be awake for the next 6 hours. Probably. Is that typical? For this kind of work? She considered it. Average, actually. He shook his head once, not criticizing it, just taking it in. I'll brief the squad at 0600 Thursday. Modified route, security component. Follow the plan exactly. Good. She started walking. Mara. She stopped. That thing you said to me, the first day, after the course. That figuring out the distinction between protecting your team and protecting your assumption about someone, you said most people never figure that out. She waited. I've been thinking about it, he said. The reason I had you wrong wasn't protecting my team. It was protecting the idea that I already knew what was possible in a situation I was already supposed to be the expert on. He paused. That's different. She looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said. It is. She walked down the corridor and the building settled its nighttime sounds around her. HVAC and generator and the faint percussion of the installation's perimeter doing what perimeters did through the hours when most people slept. And she pulled out her satellite communicator and made the call to confirm that Marcus Caldwell was alive and working. And when the confirmation came back, she stood alone in the corridor for a moment and let herself feel the specific private relief of information that only matters if you let it matter. Then she opened her notebook to a clean page and began writing the summary that would need to be in the coordination cell's hands before 0600. She finished the summary at 0347 and transmitted it through the satellite communicator with the kind of exhaustion that settled into the body's margins rather than its center, present but not disabling, the particular tiredness of someone who had slept in 4-hour windows for most of their adult professional life and had learned to function in the territory between rested and depleted. The coordination cell's acknowledgement came back in 11 minutes. 2 words. Confirmed. Proceed. She set the communicator on the desk beside her notebook, looked at the window showing nothing but the exterior wall of the adjacent building gray in the pre-dawn, and let herself sit for 3 minutes without doing anything at all. Not processing, not planning, just sitting in the chair in the small room with her boots still on and the overhead light doing what overhead lights in military barracks rooms did at 4 in the morning, which was illuminate everything with equal and unforgiving clarity. Then she stood up, splashed water on her face at the small sink, and went back to work. Thursday arrived the way West Texas mornings arrived in summer. Not gradually, but as an event. The sky went from black to deep blue to a hard, flat brightness in the space of 40 minutes. And by the time Ramirez's squad assembled at the vehicle park at 05:30 for convoy prep, the heat was already building at the edges. Mara stood at the perimeter of the vehicle park and watched the prep happen. 12 vehicles, a mix of MRAPs and standard transport, being worked through their pre-mission checks with the unhurried efficiency of soldiers who had done this enough times that the routine was in the muscle. Ramirez moved through the formation doing the specific kind of leadership that didn't announce itself. A word here, a check there, adjusting the comm setup on the lead vehicle with his own hands. When the specialist running it got a setting wrong, not making a production of the correction. Solis was in the third vehicle, running his check with a focus she hadn't seen from him in the casual context of the past few days. He knew something was different about this exercise. He didn't know the shape of it, but the energy of someone who trusted their sergeant's read on a situation and was responding to that read was visible in everything he did. She had her own morning schedule to run. Fenton had been in the interview room since 2100 the previous evening, with breaks, and by 0600 he had said enough to be useful and not enough to be complete. I was 29 years old and had made a decision at Fort Bliss 18 months ago that he had been living inside ever since, and the decision had a context he'd been partially honest about and partially not, and the criminal investigation agents working him understood the difference and were patient with it. She sat in on the 0630 session for 40 minutes. Fenton sat across the table from the agents with the diminished quality of someone who had been awake all night and had spent most of that night running cost-benefit calculations that kept arriving at the same uncomfortable answer. He was not a sophisticated intelligence asset. He was a logistics specialist who had been recruited through a financial vulnerability, debt, a family situation he'd never mentioned in his personnel file, and had been run by a handler he'd only ever met twice in person, both times off the installation at a truck stop outside Kerrville. The handler had a name that Fenton knew, and at 0644, he said it. The criminal investigation agent writing notes looked at his partner, and Mara looked at the wall, because the name connected to something in the coordination cell's external mapping that she'd been read into during the 0347 transmission acknowledgement, and the confirmation of that connection meant the operation's external thread was now complete enough to pull. She left the interview room at 0651 and sent a 3-word message to her handler. Name confirmed. Fenton. The reply took 4 minutes. External collection authorized. 12 hours. The convoy exercise departed the vehicle park at 0730 on the modified route. Mara watched the column move out from the operations building's second-floor window, 12 vehicles spaced at appropriate intervals, radio checks going out on the tactical frequency she'd confirmed with Ramirez the evening before. The lead vehicle's antenna disappeared past the gate and the dust rose and settled. She turned from the window. Hayes was in his office, confined to the installation pending the coordination cell's formal determination on the operation's status. He'd been there since 0500, which she knew because she'd checked. The confinement wasn't punitive in a formal sense. He was a senior officer with an active security clearance and an operation in progress. But it was real, and the fact that it was real without being formal was the kind of institutional weight that didn't announce itself but pressed steadily. She went to his office at 0745. He was at his desk with a coffee and a report he wasn't reading. He looked up when she came in, and the exhaustion on his face was genuine in a way it hadn't been before the conference room the previous evening, as if the performance energy of the past 3 days had finally been released and left behind what was underneath. Fenton gave up the handler's name, she said. Hayes set down the report, which means the external collection is moving. Within 12 hours. He nodded slowly. He looked at the window. 22 months, he said. Not bitterly, factually. The way someone states the cost of something after the expenditure has been made. The operation runs to completion, she said. The coordination cell is confident. The network? Mapped well enough to take apart. Fenton's channel, your controlled feed, The decision trace from the last 3 transmissions, it's enough. He was quiet for a moment. The November exercise, what Fenton passed before I arrived. The coordination cell has it. It's part of the case package. My soldiers were on that route. He said it without looking at her. I know. I watched Fenton move his first drop 6 weeks after I arrived, and I documented it and I let it continue because taking him down would have burned the external network before the mapping was complete. He pressed his hands flat on the desk surface. I've been a senior officer at this installation for 14 months, and I made the calculation that the long-game outcome justified the short-term exposure, and I stand behind that calculation operationally, and I will carry the other part of it for considerably longer than this operation will run. She looked at him. There was nothing performative in what he'd just said. No bid for sympathy, no positioning. It was a man accounting for something accurately. Yes, she said. You will. He looked at her then. That's not absolution. No, it's not. Good. He picked up his coffee. I don't want absolution from this. I want the operation to close successfully and the network dismantled and Fenton's victims, the people who were exposed by his actual traffic, accounted for. That's what I want. She stood. The coordination cell will determine your status within 48 hours of the external collection, she said. Until then, your confinement to the installation continues. I know. Is there anything you need? He almost smiled. It was tired and small and genuine. A different 14 months. She left his office and pulled the door shut behind her. The convoy returned at 1340. Clean run, no incidents, modified route executed exactly as planned. Ramirez's after-action report landed on her desk at 1430. 3 pages. Thorough, noting a radio fault in Vehicle 8 that had been resolved in the field, and a timing variance in the second leg that he'd attributed to a terrain feature that wasn't in the original route matrix. The timing variance was in the coordination cell's hands by 1445. At 6623, her satellite communicator vibrated with a message that was longer than anything her handler had sent previously. She read it standing in the maintenance corridor where she'd sheltered from rain on her first night at the installation, the familiar smell of electrical conduit and old carpet around her. The external handler, the name Fenton had given in the interview room, had been collected by a joint team at 1541 at a location in San Antonio. The collection had been clean. 2 additional network members had been identified through decision trace analysis and were being located. The commercial relay architecture Fenton's network had used for 14 months was being systematically shut down. The coordination cell was recommending a full operation stand-down with a successful conclusion determination. She read it twice, committed it, deleted it. Then she stood in the corridor for a moment and listened to the installation doing its afternoon things around her, the specific, constant, unspectacular sound of a place that continued. Colonel Decker called her into his office at 1700. He was standing at the window when she arrived, which was different from the seated authority posture she'd seen in every previous meeting. Standing at a window was something people did when they were still processing rather than directing. She sat in the chair across from his desk without being invited and waited. He turned around eventually. He looked like a man who had spent the past 24 hours absorbing information that reordered things he'd thought he understood and hadn't finished reordering them. The external collection succeeded, he said. Yes, sir? Hayes's operation closes successful. Per the coordination cell's determination, yes. He sat down at his desk. He looked at the clear surface of it for a moment. I've been commanding this installation for 23 months, he said. In that time, I commissioned an investigation into a security compromise, had the investigator's findings managed by the person being investigated, watched an operation run inside my installation for 14 of those months without my knowledge, and received the officer I'd been managing as a potential security threat as the person who actually closed the case. He paused. That's a fairly comprehensive picture of everything that can go wrong with compartmentalization. It's also a picture of an operation that succeeded, she said. The external network is down. The people receiving your installation's operational information have been collected. The actors inside this installation have been identified and removed. Fenton and wages. Fenton will cooperate fully in exchange for a reduced charge package. He's not a sophisticated asset. He was recruited through a vulnerability and run by a handler he had limited understanding of. His cooperation has direct value. She paused. Wages is less certain. He had more active agency in what he did. The camera manipulation required ongoing decision-making, not just carrying a package. They're both young. Fenton's youth is a mitigating factor. Wages made 12 independent decisions to blind security systems for an active dead drop operation. 12 separate occasions where he could have stopped. She kept her voice even. That's not something that mitigates cleanly. Decker looked at her with the expression of a man who didn't like the answer but recognized its accuracy. And Hayes. The coordination cell will determine his status. My assessment is that his operation was conducted within authorized parameters, however those parameters were established, and the outcome justifies the architecture. She paused. My assessment also includes the observation that operating an active controlled feed inside a garrison installation without the commanding officer's knowledge created risks that weren't fully accounted for in the authorization, including the Caldwell situation, and that those risks should inform how similar operations are structured in the future. Will that assessment go anywhere? It goes into the after action, which goes to levels above both of us. Decker was quiet for a moment. What was your actual mission, Lieutenant? She had expected the question. She'd been deciding how to answer it since the conference room the previous evening. I was sent to identify and document the security compromise at Fort Redstone, she said. My cover assignment as Joint Ops Coordinator was accurate in describing my authorized access level and my right to be here. The investigative component was not in the cover documentation, because the investigation included Hayes as a potential subject. Yes, sir. And because my installation was the subject of the investigation. Yes, sir. He pressed his hands flat on the desk. She'd seen that gesture 3 times now and understood it as his version of the physical management of something that wanted a different outlet. Did you know about Hayes's operation when you arrived? No. My briefing identified him as a subject alongside Fenton. The code phrase that confirmed his operational status was provided to me in real time during the conference room. Decker looked at her for a long time. She held it without discomfort. You're good at what you do, he said. It wasn't flattery. It was the assessment of a senior officer making an accurate determination. I had good support, she said. Ramirez. Solis. Ramirez will want to know what actually happened. He deserves to know, within what the classification allows. She paused. I'd recommend a full briefing on the operational summary, the Fenton network, Wages' role, the outcome. The Hayes component stays classified, but his squad operated in good faith throughout this process, and they should understand what they were part of. Decker nodded. I'll handle that briefing personally. Good. She stood. Sir, one more thing. Go ahead. Marcus Caldwell. He spent 4 months believing he'd been shut down by an institution he trusted. I was pulled out of an investigation that mattered to him before he could finish it, without explanation, and placed in a holding status that had the shape of abandonment. She looked at the colonel steadily. When the classification allows it, when the operation is fully closed and the case package is settled, he should be told the full story, not a summary, the full story. He earned that. Decker looked at her for a moment. That's not typically how these things are handled. I know. Is that a recommendation or a request? Both. He held her gaze. I'll see what I can do. It wasn't a commitment. It was as close to one as the situation allowed, and she accepted it. She found Ramirez at the eastern fence line at 1800, in the same spot he'd been standing the first time she'd come looking for him 3 days ago. The dry wash below the fence was purple in the evening light, and the scrub on the far side moved in a wind that hadn't reached the installation yet. He heard her coming and turned before she reached him. Colonel Decker is briefing the squad tomorrow morning, she said. I know, he called me an hour ago. He turned back to the fence line. He said the summary would be classified but complete within that constraint. It will be. They stood side by side for a moment, looking at nothing in particular in the way people looked at landscape when they were actually looking at what had just happened. The convoy, Ramirez said, clean run. Yes. I didn't know what I was running toward this morning. You ran it right anyway. That's the job. Yes, she said. It is. He was quiet for a moment. Fenton's been on my installation for 8 months. I've eaten in the same mess hall with him, checked his equipment, run him through evaluations. His jaw shifted. I didn't see it. He was run by a professional network. You weren't supposed to see it. Wages was 24 years old. Yes. He sat on that duty station and blinded 12 cameras for drops. He shook his head slowly. I brought him up through the vehicle maintenance evaluation last month. He did good work. He was polite. He asked questions that suggested he was actually thinking about the job. He paused. I never looked past that. Neither did Hayes, she said, for different reasons. He turned to look at her. Hayes. I can't tell you the full picture yet. Maybe eventually. What I can tell you is that the situation was more complicated than it looked, and the people responsible for the actual compromise have been collected, and your installation is clean. He absorbed that. You're leaving. Wasn't a question, but she answered it. Tomorrow morning. He nodded once. He looked back at the dry wash. First morning you were here, I told my squad you were a desk officer, a paperwork specialist. I heard. You heard that? Sound carries in a mess hall. He was quiet for a moment, and then he made a sound that was somewhere between a short exhale and a laugh. Involuntary, honest, the kind of sound that came out when something landed as simultaneously absurd and entirely deserved. I owe you about 14 apologies, he said. You owe me one, she said. You gave it at the fence line the first day. Everything after that you earned back. He looked at her. You counted. I always count. The wind that had been on the far side of the fence reached them, dry and carrying the smell of caliche and warm grass, and moved through and kept going. What happens now, he said. For you. Another assignment. How long do you get between them? She thought about it honestly. Depends. On what? On what needs doing and whether I'm the right tool for it. She paused. Usually about 2 weeks. He shook his head slightly. Not criticism. Something more like recognition of a life that operated on different arithmetic than most. If something like this happens again, he said, on an installation somewhere, and you needed, I don't know, someone who knows how to move a convoy through contested terrain without tipping the opposition. She looked at him. I'm useful in the field, he said. It was a statement without self-promotion, just accurate. I know. I'm not asking to be on your list, I'm just saying. He paused. You worked with me for 3 days. You have a read on what I can do. If it's ever relevant, I'll remember, she said. He looked at her for a moment. That's not nothing. No, she said. It's not. They stood there another minute, the installation settling into its evening routines behind them. And then she said goodnight and walked back toward Building 4, and he stayed at the fence line, and neither of them made it into more than what it was, which was two professionals who had done hard work together and arrived somewhere neither of them had fully expected. She was packed by 2100. The room looked the way it had when she arrived. Cot, wall locker, desk bolted to the wall, window looking at the exterior wall of the next building. She had unpacked and repacked and left no material trace of herself in the space, which was habit rather than intention, but amounted to the same thing. She sat on the edge of the cot for a few minutes. Her satellite communicator had 2 messages waiting. The first was from her handler, confirming the full operation stand-down and providing the timeline for the case package closure. The second was shorter, from a number she didn't recognize, and it said, I heard you were asking about me. Caldwell. Thank you. She stared at that for a moment. Then she typed back, You would have found it. You were already close. The reply came in 40 seconds. Maybe. You were faster. Buy you a coffee sometime. She almost smiled. Sometime, she wrote back. She put the communicator in her bag and lay down on the cot without taking her boots off and looked at the ceiling, which was the same institutional off-white ceiling that every room like this and every installation in the country featured. And she thought about the last 3 days in the sequential way she always processed completed operations. Not searching for errors, just letting it settle into the category of finished things. Fenton would cooperate and receive a reduced sentence that would still define the next decade of his life. Wages would face a harder accounting. The external handler collected in San Antonio would spend a long time in a room explaining things to people who were very patient and very good at their work. The foreign connected network that had been receiving information from Fort Redstone for 14 months would spend the next year discovering piece by piece that what they'd built had been quietly mapped and then systematically taken apart. Hayes would return to work, in some form, because the operation had succeeded, and the institutional apparatus treated success as its own form of authorization. She didn't have a clean feeling about that, and she wasn't going to manufacture one. The calculation he'd made was defensible in the operational logic and costly in the human one, and both of those things were true simultaneously, and the institution would weight them according to its own values and come to its own determination. And her assessment was in the after-action and would be read by the people who made those determinations, and that was the extent of her influence over it. Marcus Caldwell was working an external operation and had thanked her for something she'd done without knowing him. That felt, unexpectedly, like more than she'd thought it would. Ramirez was at the fence line, or in his rack, or somewhere in this installation, being the specific kind of soldier that institutions produced occasionally and never fully understood. The kind who trusted results over assumptions, who revised quickly and without drama, who ran a convoy in the dark without knowing exactly why, and ran it exactly right, because that was the standard he held for himself rather than the one the situation explicitly required. She would remember him. The way she remembered the handful of people in the past decade who had surprised her by being genuinely better than her first read of them. It wasn't a long list. It didn't need to be. She set her watch for 0430 and closed her eyes. The sedan arrived at 0600, and the driver was a young specialist who didn't make conversation, which she appreciated. She walked out of Building 4 with her bag over one shoulder and the morning air still holding its pre-dawn cool, the sky going orange and blue at the eastern edge of the installation where it backed up against the flat horizon. The training course was visible through a gap in the buildings as she walked past. The high wall, the rope obstacles, the water channel, empty and still in the early light. Solis was standing near the vehicle park entrance. He was in PT gear, which meant he'd either just finished an early run or was about to start one, and he was standing in the particular way of someone who had positioned themselves deliberately near a route they knew someone would take. She stopped in front of him. He looked at her for a moment. "The colonel's briefing is at 0800, he said. "I know." "I'll hear it then, the version you can tell." He paused. "I figure there's a longer version." "There usually is." He looked at the training course visible through the gap. "I was useful." She held his gaze. "You were." He nodded once, absorbing that with the slightly stiff self-consciousness of someone who'd wanted to hear it and wasn't sure what to do with it now that he had. "Are you going somewhere that's—" He stopped, started again. "Is it worth it, the kind of work you do?" She looked at him. He was 22 and earnest and better at this than he knew yet, and the question was genuine. "Ask me something easier," she said. He almost smiled. "Is there anything easier?" "Not in my experience." He stepped aside and she walked past him toward the sedan. "Ma'am," he called after her. She stopped without turning. "For what it's worth, you were right about the mess hall the first night." He was protecting his assumption, not us. A pause. "I knew it then. I just didn't say it." She turned around. "Then say it next time." "Yes, ma'am." She got in the sedan. The drive out took her past the main gate, past the guard shack, past the concrete barriers, and the flags, and the perimeter road that she'd run in the dark on her first morning here. The installation receded in the rear window and became a collection of rooftops against the sky, and then disappeared behind a rise in the road, and the landscape opened out into the flat West Texas expanse that went on past where the eye could follow. She turned forward and didn't look back. There was a message from her handler on the communicator. The new assignment, preliminary briefing, a location that was not West Texas. She read it once, set the communicator in her lap, and looked at the road ahead. The work continued. That was the nature of it. Not because the work was endless. It ended, each piece of it, the way this one had ended, with something closed and accounted for and moved into the category of finished things. But because the need for it didn't stop. There would always be another installation, another compromise, another situation that looked like one thing and was another. There would always be people who made decisions in ambiguous spaces and lived with the weight of those decisions in ways that didn't fit cleanly into the official record. There would always be someone running something that the official record couldn't see, for reasons both defensible and indefensible, and the distance between those two categories was where the actual work happened. She didn't love the work the way people in films loved their work, with clarity and certainty and the sense that every hard thing was building toward a visible monument. It was messier than that. It left residue. It required her to hold multiple truths in the same space and choose action anyway. And sometimes the action was right, and sometimes it was approximately right, and occasionally it was something she would sit with for a long time afterward without resolution. But it was necessary, and she was built for it. And those two things together were enough. The sedan moved through the heat shimmer of the West Texas morning, and Fort Redstone was behind her, and the next thing was ahead. And somewhere back in that installation, a sergeant who had learned something about his own assumptions was briefing a squad that had earned the right to understand what they'd been part of, and a young soldier who'd asked a question he meant was lacing up for a run, and a colonel was sitting in his cleared surface office thinking about how things worked in the spaces between what was documented and what was real. They would go on being what they were, better by small degrees for having had the past 3 days be what they were. She would go on being what she was. None of it was clean or resolved in the permanent sense. The world didn't operate in permanent resolutions. It operated in the ongoing accumulation of what people chose to do when they couldn't see the full picture and had to move anyway. That was the only kind of courage that actually mattered, not the kind that existed in the presence of certainty, the kind that moved without it. The most dangerous thing you can do is decide you already know who someone is before they've shown you. Not because it makes you wrong about them. Sometimes you're right. But because the moment you stop looking, you stop learning. And the moment you stop learning is the moment the situation becomes something you didn't account for. Look harder. Revise faster. The person you underestimated is already 3